Adopting an animal can be a difficult thing to do, as you just don't know how it will behave. So when a man's adopted dog wouldn't stop behaving strangely, he wanted to return the strange dog to the shelter. But then she discovered something that broke her heart. Anthony had just moved to a new city for work. It was something he was very excited to do. He loved his job and thought moving to fulfill his dream was an adventure worth living. However, although Anthony was happy with the idea of starting a new chapter in his life, he couldn't help but feel a little lonely. This was because he knew absolutely no one in the area, and also without his friends or family, he felt quite isolated. Having been an animal lover most of his life, especially dogs, Anthony decided to adopt a puppy to have someone to keep him company on a daily basis. With this in mind, the man began researching the different dog shelters in the area to see what kind of dogs were up for adoption and if he thought any of them were right for him. After looking on the page of one of the local shelters, Anthony found a beautiful puppy that he simply couldn't help but fall in love with at first sight. The dog was a black Labrador named Reggie, and, according to the description, the puppy was ready to be adopted and placed in his new forever home. Immediately, Anthony called the shelter to inquire about the puppy and discovered, to his dismay, that quite a few other people had already inquired about the dog. However, the shelter staff told the young man that none of the other candidates were a good fit and that they were still looking for the right person to take Reggie. The staff member then told Anthony that he was welcome to come to the shelter to see Reggie in person and see if they connected. Not wanting to miss the opportunity to adopt the canine, Anthony quickly headed to the shelter as soon as he got off the phone. Upon arriving at the shelter, Anthony was surprised to learn that Reggie had been left there with his own food bowl, bed, and new tennis balls. Anthony thought it was a little strange that the dog was given these items, as it seemed to indicate that whoever his owner was still loved him and wanted the animal to be as comfortable as possible. However, instead of dwelling on this idea, Anthony was soon filled with joy when the shelter staff told him that they thought he would be the perfect person for Reggie. Once he signed all the paperwork, Anthony took Reggie back home with him, hoping to spend time with his new pet. But instead of the puppy being excited to be adopted and taken to his new forever home, Reggie seemed to feel the opposite of that. Upon arriving at the house, the dog refused to enter the home, almost as if he was rejecting the building and what it meant to him. In the end, Anthony had to lift the big dog up and walk through the door with him in his arms. Once the dog was inside the house, however, things still weren't easy for either the canine or the man. Every time Anthony looked at Reggie, he couldn't help but think that the dog looked incredibly sad. Wanting to try to help the animal adjust and feel more comfortable in his new surroundings, Anthony called the shelter to see if they could give him more information about the dog's background. Unfortunately, the shelter was just as clueless as Anthony. Seeing that there was nothing he could do about the dog's despondent behavior, Anthony decided to continue as normal and hoped that the dog would eventually perk up. However, 2 weeks later, nothing had changed. Reggie was still as sad and depressed as when he first brought him home. On top of that, the dog was misbehaving. According to the dog's new owner, Reggie was a bit destructive. During an interview, he commented that he chewed on a pair of shoes and some unpacked boxes. "I was too harsh with him and he resented it, I could tell," said Anthony. This resentment certainly didn't help him bond better with the animal. Not knowing what else to do, Anthony began to think that perhaps it would be best to take the dog back to the shelter so he could find a better home with a family that would make him happy. Deciding that that would be the best option, Anthony began going through the box of items they had left with Reggie to find the dog's collar and leash. However, while going through the contents of the box, he found an unopened envelope that piqued his curiosity. When Reggie noticed the envelope in Anthony's hand, the pup perked up slightly. It was almost as if the sight, or possibly the smell of the object, was familiar to the dog and brought back pleasant memories. Unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Anthony opened the letter and began to read it. However, he could never have prepared himself for what he would end up reading. The letter began, "To whomever gets my dog." Well, I can't say I'm glad you're reading this letter. A letter I asked the shelter for that could only be opened by Reggie's new owner. Anthony read on, interested in what the previous owner had to say about Reggie, as the person clearly seemed to have loved the dog. The letter went on to say, "I'm not even happy to write it. If you are reading this, it means I just returned from my last car ride with my Labrador after leaving him at the shelter. He knew this trip was different. I packed his bed and toys and put them by the back door before the trip, but this time it's like I could sense something was wrong." Still confused, but slightly dreading what might come next, Anthony continued reading the letter. He ended up discovering that Reggie was a big fan of tennis balls and would sometimes put 2 in his mouth. In fact, the puppy was so enamored with the objects that he would carelessly run into the middle of the road simply to follow the ball and retrieve it. At this point in the letter, the previous owner subsequently warned Anthony not to throw the balls near the road. The letter stated, "He loves tennis balls, the more the merrier. Sometimes I think he is part squirrel because of the way he hoards them. He usually has 2 in his mouth and tries to get a 3rd one in there. He hasn't done it yet. No matter which way you throw the ball, he'll jump after it, so be careful." Anthony also learned that Reggie was lightly trained and knew a few tricks, such as sitting, standing still, and even high-fiving. But because the letter was so detailed and clearly showed so much love for the dog, Anthony wondered why Reggie was sent to the shelter. However, as the young man read on, he began to understand a little more about the canine's quirky personality. The letter went on to say, "Finally, be patient with him. I've never married, so it's just been me his whole life. He is used to going everywhere with me, so if you can, include him in your daily car trips." The letter continued, "He loves being around people, especially me, which means this transition is going to be difficult if he's going to be living with someone new." But it was the next part of the letter that broke Anthony's heart. The young man discovered that Reggie's name was actually Tank, which made it much clearer why the dog never responded to his name when Anthony called him. The letter read, "He's a smart dog. He will get used to his new name and eventually respond. But I couldn't bear to give him his real name. For me to do that was to admit that I would never see him again." It turned out that the dog's real name was Tank, named for the job of his previous owner, who was actually in the U.S. Army as an armor crewman EM-1 who operated tanks. The owner, a man named Paul Mallory, had apparently told the Army that if anything happened to him while he was on duty, he wanted them to call the local shelter and tell them to put Tank up for adoption, as he would not be coming home. It appeared that, unfortunately, Mallory was killed in action while saving some of his fellow soldiers. Fortunately, the military granted her last wish and told the shelter to find a loving family for the puppy to go to. However, it wasn't until Anthony showed up that they were able to do so. After finishing the letter, Anthony folded it and gently called Tank's name. Upon hearing his name, the dog began to slowly wag his tail. Anthony said, "It's me now, Tank. Just you and me. Your old friend gave you to me. So, what do you say we play a little ball?" At that moment, the dog ran away, only to return with a tennis ball in his mouth. It was from that moment on that Anthony knew that he and Tank were going to be best friends. What an incredibly sweet story. There are always plenty of animals looking for a second chance at life. So if you're looking for a new 4-legged friend, remember to adopt, not buy. Let us know your thoughts about this great story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing stories. See you next time.